Well, I think those of you who had to join have joined. So let me begin today's class and presentation. Today, as I told you in the group, we will be dealing with a slightly more complex topic, slightly more in the sense in a bit more nuanced and complex compared to the little terms that we had done in the last couple of classes. Okay, that is narrative and narratology. Now, I am just beginning to present the screen, but before that, I will just give you a brief idea of why we actually study narrative or narratology at the undergraduate level. Now, as I told you in earlier classes, the fact that literature deals with expressions of a poet, a novelist, a playwright, which revolve around stories. Okay. So, whenever we read something, the first question that comes to us is that what is the writer wanting to tell? Okay. What is the writer wanting to tell? If we read a novel, with the first target is to know its story. Okay. Or if you read a poem, the first target is knowing the summary. What is this poem about? Okay. Even if you see a play or a film, the first target is to know what happens in that play or film. Okay. This is a very, very common human desire. It's a very, very common human desire. The desire that one needs to know a story of a literary work, and only after reading the story will that person or the reader think that they know what that work is about. Okay, so therefore, when a writer narrates a series of events, he narrates the series of events with a purpose. What is the purpose? The purpose is to let the readers know what happens in a sequence, and then give a particular perspective to that narration. What do I mean by this? By this I mean, for example, if you say the king died, the king died. Okay, full stop. Then you say the queen died thereafter. Thereafter means after the king died, the queen died. Okay. When you say this, the readers can understand that the death of the king and the queen may not be directly linked with one another. The king died, the queen died after that. The reader may also think that the queen died because of sorrow following her husband, the king's death. Right? So it depends on a writer to exactly portray the perspective in which he is wanting the story to be read or understood by the readers or the audience. Okay. Therefore, it is extremely necessary for us as students of literature to know the idea of a narrative so that we can understand literary works better, right? Like, for example, if I tell, if I tell what I saw the series of incidents that happened on the road yesterday. It means what? It means I am giving some authenticity. I saw. I am not, I am not narrating what others said to me. I saw personally. Now, when I say that I saw the series of events, you will tend to think that okay, sir has seen, then it must be authentic. Okay. But if I say my friend has said me the series of incidents that happened yesterday on the street, you may think that maybe sir's friend saw it and narrated it to sir. Sir is narrating it to us with some additions or alterations, or sir may have forgotten something, and therefore it is coming to us in a different perspective. Okay, so how a story is narrated is of extreme significance in literature. Or who narrates, who writes the poem, who writes the novel, which is the character which is narrating the story in the novel, etc. Right? So, we begin the presentation on narrative and narratology. Narratology means study of narratives, right? And narrative, the word narrative indicates the art of relating a sequence of events in a particular perspective. In a particular perspective. Okay. Now, if we look at the presentation, just let me present my screen. Screen share. So in the meantime, as is the case with your online classes, please type your names in the chat box. Since the chat box is also recorded, I'll be transferring this attendance to your register. Okay, you'll have to enter your name once now and once when I tell at the fag end of the class. Okay, so now let me begin my uh, screen presentation. Okay, I hope my screen is clear to you. Now, the first thing that we have to keep in mind, as we have already suggested, what is narratology? Narratology is the humanities discipline dedicated to the study of the principles and practices of narrative representation. That is, how do we tell a story? This is extremely important, and today this idea of narratology has touched various theories, concepts, and procedures. Okay, now it began in the 1960s with the names of a few structuralist linguists. We will study them later. And today, when we study narratology, we usually study the core question as to how do the stories impact us? How do the stories impact us, either culturally or otherwise? And when we speak of narratology, it is not that it is limited only to literature. It applies to novels, films, even oral tales, somebody telling you a story verbally, journalism, video games, and even everyday conversations. Right? So there is just nothing among us which expresses something but which does not have a context, right? So this is narratology. Now, the origin of narratology deals with a single difference between a story and a discourse. Now, what is a story? We know all stories. We have heard of stories. Stories are just the sequence of events as they really happened in a chronological logic. That is, when you narrate a story to someone else, you begin in a chronological fashion. That is, you begin with the earliest incident first and then go on progressively as time progresses to later incidents. Okay, this is story. But discourse is something else. It is the way in which the events are arranged, selected, and presented to the reader. Right? So there may be events which you may omit while you are narrating a story. Right? So when you are omitting a series of events which composes a story, which deals with a story, what happens is that the story changes its perspective. Like, you have a friend, okay? You have a friend, you are very good friends, then suddenly your relationship with your friend was somehow spoiled because of any quarrel or whatever. Thereafter, whenever you are asked to speak of your friend, you will tend to focus more on the negative aspects of the friend than the positive aspects. That is the usual experience, right? Why does this happen? This happens because you are choosing the negative aspects more than the positive aspects and narrating it. Okay, so your story may remain the same, but the way in which you are arranging the story, that may change. Why? Because your good relationship with your friend is now no longer good. You will focus only on the negative aspects of your friend, right? So this is the reason why narratives are very, very important. Okay, now when we study literature, as I told you in the introduction, the first question that we ask is, what is the story about? Okay, now what is the story about? That story is a plot if there is a cause and effect relationship between its events. Like, as you can see in the first part of this slide, a plot has a causal organization. That is, when you say, it was raining very heavily since the morning and I reached my office late. This is a plot. Why? Because you are telling the reason why you reached your office late, because it was already raining. Okay, this is a plot. So therefore, a plot will have a causal relationship. Why did you reach your office late? Because it was raining. You're telling it from the within the sentence itself. Now, Aristotle, we will study Aristotle later, defined a plot as the soul of tragedy, where he said that a well-formed plot has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Okay, now look at the third slide. As I told you, I gave this example a bit earlier. Now, how do you differentiate between a story and a plot? Look at the first quote. The king died, then the queen died. This is a story. But when you tell the same thing slightly differently, the king died, then the queen died of grief. This is a plot. Why? Because here you are telling the reason why the queen died. She died of grief. Therefore, a plot is a story with causality. Once you add causality to a story, the causality means the reason of something. Then it becomes a plot. Right? Therefore, the title of the slide is, as you can see, plot is something which shapes events into meaning. Okay. Now the question is, who is the one who is narrating? Who is writing a poem? Who is writing a play? Who is the person who is speaking as I in a novel? He is the narrator. Right? Now, there are two types of narrators. One is the type who stands outside the novel and sees everything and narrates. He told this to so and so, or he was thinking so and so since the morning. Such a narrator is called a heterodiegetic narrator. Hetero means they are separate or they are outside the main body. Okay. A homodiegetic narrator is one who is a character within the story, like a first person narrator. When a novel begins with this I, this thing, I am a boy of 14 years old, and so on. I am a 14-year-old boy, or and that character narrates the novel as a first person narrator, I. Then the narrator is called a homodiegetic narrator. So a possible question can come in this narrator and narratology, or narrative and narratology, as is how are the heterodiegetic narrator different from a homodiegetic narrator? In such a case, you have to tell that in one case the narrator stands outside the story world and narrates the story in the third person, and in the other case the narrator is himself or herself a character in the story and therefore narrates the story in the first person. Right? So these are the two types of narrators that we encounter in literature. Now we come to narratology. Okay. Now, as you can see, just for a moment, forget the left pyramidal shape. Look at the right, focus on the right. Narratology separates voice, that is who speaks, from focalization, who perceives. Remember, the narrator and the focalizer need not be the same entity. Okay. When there is no focus, zero focalization, the narrator is an omniscient narrator. That is, he knows everything about everybody and is narrating accordingly. Right? The reverse is the internal focalization, means the narrator is restricted to one character and narrates or focuses only on that character's perception and horizon. I'll give you examples. The third is external focalization, means the narrator knows less than the characters. In literature, we get all three of them. I'll give an example. For example, in a history book, right? A historian is narrating facts about, let's say, a king. Let's say an English king who fought against the invaders and sacrificed his life and lost the battle, obviously. Right? So the historian who is narrating it, for example, if he is an Indian historian, he will narrate it with zero focalization, because he is here the omniscient narrator who knows both sides, the English king's side as well as the invading king's side, right? But if the historian, for example, is an Englishman who is very proud of his nationality and the bravery of his kings, he is likely to portray the invader who has attacked and killed his king in a negative or a bad light, right? Just as in the narratives of India's struggle for freedom, most of us would narrate the stories of freedom struggle showing the Britishers in a very bad and cruel light. Okay, so therefore, who is seeing it? That is of extreme importance in any type of narratology. Who is seeing it? If that English king's story is narrated by a French historian, he will narrate the story in a totally different light, telling perhaps that the French king could easily invade and defeat the English king because the English king was weak militarily, right? Therefore, whenever you are encountering any work of literature, as a reader, you have to know and understand who is the one who is seeing the events. Because unless you know that, it will not be possible for you as a critic to appreciate and evaluate the narrative strategy or narrative skill or competence of the writer. Right? Now we come to the concept of time in the narrative. This is again very important. Very often, we see that time proceeds in a rather chronological manner in most narratives. Chronological manner means, for example, if you are seeing a Hindi film, let's say, if it focuses on a hero and the hero is growing up in a particular locality, the film will begin with the hero as a child, and then as the plot progresses, he will be portrayed as an adolescent, then as a young man, then as a man with an element of maturity, then a middle-aged man, then a man who is approaching old age, and then finally old age. This is the sequence that most of the narrators would maintain. But there can also be a sequence when the story begins with the hero in old age, thinking back in time to when he was young, or he was growing up, or he was struggling as a youth. Right? So, in a narrative, time can proceed either forward or backward, depending on what perspective the writer or the director in a film, for example, wishes to focus. Right? So, this is the importance of time in a narrative. Keep this in mind, because there can be, for example, a possible question on, or anybody can ask you, is time related with your idea of a narrative? Obviously, yes, time is related to a narrative, because on the way in which time is treated, either chronologically or flashback, perspectives of the narrative will change. Right? Now, what are the commonly seen narrative types? The first type is a very primary level narrative style, where the main narrative deals with a principal action. It goes on progressing from one to the next. The hero is born, the hero grows up, then the hero is a young man, then the hero faces a lot of difficulties, then he marries, then he begets children, then he migrates to a different country to earn money, then there are complications, then he returns back home, and so on. This is a primary level narrative. A secondary level narrative is like a story within a story. That is how most epics, for example, they are narrated. Like in our case of the Mahabharata, it is a classic example of a person narrating what happened in the Mahabharata to a group of sages who have gathered together. Right? And then the Mahabharata. So it's a story within a story. This is called meta-diegetic narrative. Right? The third one is a typical style adopted by modernist and postmodernist fiction. That is, you go forward and backward, you jump time, you jump sequences, you bring in a new narrator, right? You transform a particular narrator. In other words, the entire narration will look like a continuous unraveling of newer and newer modes of thought and existence. This is a typical postmodern construct. Why is it a postmodern construct? Because one of the founding aspects of postmodernism is that nothing ever happens in a sequence, in a well-ordered sequence as we imagine it to be. And therefore, if literature is to reflect life, then the literature that reflects life as it happens should reflect the chaos, both in actions and in thoughts, that accompany characters in a literary work. Right? We don't think grammatically. At one moment we think of this, in the next moment our thought jumps to something else, and the next moment our thought jumps to totally different thing. And if literature is to reflect life or thought, then this transgression will occur in the narrative. Hence it is called metalepsis. In other words, a narrative form where there is no fixed narrative level. If you search YouTube, you will be seeing a number of postmodern films, for example, films. They do not tend to tell a story. In fact, at the end of the film, if people ask you, what is the story of the film? You say, there is no story actually. Cinemaটা একটা গল্পই নেই, right? There is no such story in the narrative. So this is a metalepsis. In other words, a postmodern narrative where there is a transgression of narrative levels. Now, as I told you, this narratology concept, it began in the 1960s. Today, when we speak of narratives or narratology, we have different classifications of the way in which writers, filmmakers have focused on various issues in accordance with the nuances that they wish to portray in a particular work. Hence, modern narratology, it is more context based or ideology based or nuanced in culture, right? For example, if you wish to tell a story about the struggles of women in completing their education, you are likely to adopt a feminist narratology, right? If you are writing or narrating a story which deals with the difficulties that colonized people once faced at the hands of the colonizers, you are likely to adopt a post-colonial narratology, right? So everything depends on how you are structuring the story according to your own target. I'll give you an example from a painting, right? So this is the final slide. Just look at the painting on the right. This is a painting by a postmodern painter, sculptor, a legend called Salvatore Dali, right? What are we seeing here? We are seeing a bare branch of a tree. We are seeing a few clocks which are bent as if they are clothes put up in order to dry. Just look at the clocks. Do we see clocks like this? No. So why has the painter suddenly brought in a landscape and the painter presents clocks which are apparently very bent as if they are clothes? Why? Because through this he wishes to portray the flexibility of time. The flexibility of time. So this painting is done with a very, very common postmodern perspective which portrays that time is flexible. If you are having a good experience somewhere, time will tend to flow faster. If you are having a bad experience somewhere, time will tend to flow slower. So it all depends on the context in which you are placed in time, right? So this is the narrative of the painter when he has painted this, right? Therefore, narratology matters today. Okay, whether it's literature or a film or a painting or even a game or even journalism, narratives actually reveal our perception of realities. The painter, for example, here felt that time is very flexible as a cloth. So how do you portray this in a painting? Do you write that time is flexible, therefore? No, you are a painter. You have to paint your idea. How do you do that? You paint a few clocks which have irregular shapes, which will remind us of, let's say, the flexible clothes which are wet and which are put to dry, right? So here the key takeaway from all of this is that every narrative, be it a story, a poem, or a film, or a novel, that is a constructed representation. Constructed by whom? By the writer or by the director or by the playwright, in order to focus on how he or she wishes you to approach a plot. Right? As I told you, in that case of the history writing of an English king who was killed by an invader, if you are an English historian, it is likely that you will portray him as a martyr who sacrificed his life for the cause of his country. But if you are a historian who belongs to the opposite side, you tend to negate the English king, portraying him as maybe a coward who failed to fight well and therefore lost his life and his country. Right? So narrative and narratology, they are both significant today. Why? Because they equip us to understand the perspective in which a particular narrator wants us to approach a particular story or a particular incident or a particular novel or a poem, whatever. Right? So this is narrative and narratology. Now I will be sharing, HG sir has shared a brief note on narrative. I will be sharing another one with a slightly different perspective in your Google Classroom immediately after the class ends. Right? So this is what you need to understand with regard to narrative and narratology as literary types. Right? So we end today's class, and I will ask you to write your names again in the chat box so that I can record it and transfer your attendance. Remember, as I did the last time, the chat box recording of names will be shared in your group so that you can have a tab on your attendance. I do hope that you are all maintaining at a personal level the number of classes that are taken and the classes that you are attending, so that you yourself can get an idea of your percentage of attendance. Right? So if you have marked your names in the chat box a second time, you may leave this meeting.